Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be here for this session this afternoon. A quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further and higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to Stacey and Ali for giving us your time so generously this afternoon. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £55 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Right. Now it is my pleasure, my privilege to hand over to Stacey and Ali for our discussion this afternoon about creative translation in the English classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're both really excited to be talking to you today. I'm going to start and give you a brief overview of the Stephen Spender Trust before moving on to defining creative translation as a term, giving an overview of our approaches, and talking a little bit about a project before handing over to Ali, who will discuss some initiatives that he has run in school and show you some case studies. So a little bit about the Stephen Spender Trust. The trust was established in 1997 to honor Stephen Spender, the writer. And he was a real champion of international literature in translation, and also artists and writers' freedom of expression. And the work that we do today at the Trust is in the spirit of Stephen Spender, as we say. And we place translation at the heart of everything that we do through our initiatives, primarily the annual Poetry in Translation Prize and the Creative Translation Education programs that we run. And the real sort of mission of our work is to bring translation into schools so that young people can benefit from the inherent creativity, but also the other things that come with translation, such as intercultural awareness. Our work has 5 main components. So we train translators to become creative translation practitioners who design and deliver workshops in schools, as well as resources. We run programs that include workshops and courses, and we run these in schools. Each year we organise the Stephen Spender Prize, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. We offer CPD to MFL and English teachers, like this webinar, but also in longer formats, which might be a whole day, or it might be a series of webinars. And we collaborate with universities and cultural organisations as well. As I said, our work really focuses on translation and its benefits for young people. And translation really sits at the intersection of creativity and language skills. It promotes a creative engagement with text, whether that be literary or other types of text, and offers a playful and experimental approach to reading, listening, writing, and also speaking as well. But at the same time, it really promotes language skills by focusing on the nuts and bolts of language making. So drawing particular attention to how language is put together, how a text is put together, drawing attention to grammar rules, the use of vocabulary, the use of speech. And it draws attention to the inherent processes that are within creativity. Translation really presents creativity as a process, and we focus on that process as opposed to an outcome or the artwork at the end of it. So I've used this word a few times already, creative translation, and to my mind, almost every type of translation is creative in one way or another, whether that be, a translation of Proust or whether that be a translation of the back of a shampoo bottle. There is creativity in all types of translation. But we use this term to refer to a scaffolded step-by-step process that replicates how a professional translator would approach a text and then lays the foundations for young people to express themselves and realize their creative potential. So it's a way of using translation as a tool for creative means in order to prompt creativity. We do this by a model that we've created, and it's been developed iteratively across our schools programs since 2010. And it really is a scaffolded approach. The real benefit and the unique thing about this model is it can be used with participants, young people, students who have little or no knowledge of the source text. I'd also like that could be used by teachers, by facilitators who have little or no knowledge of the source text as well. It can be used across lots of different types of text. And we at the Stephen Spender Trust use this as a basis to structure our activities, whether that be a short worksheet, or workshops or a course. We currently are preparing a 5-session course to be delivered in the autumn in London. And this is based on this model, which we call Decode, Translate, Create. The model really replicates, it's rooted in professional translation practice, and it replicates the process a translator would go through as they approach a text. I should say here, unconsciously or consciously. So each time a translator gets a text, they begin by decoding its key features. And this might be things like who published this text or where does this text come from? But at the same time, where's this text going to end up? Who is it aimed at? Drawing on other things like tone and register. Then the next stage is translate, and it's making those translation decisions, those decisions of how the text will be translated. And finally, finding creative solutions. Again, it's that process. And in our model, those creative solutions can apply to something like translating a pun, or it can be taken in a different direction, like translating a text into another form, translating a picture, and then bringing in the question of adaptation as well. In terms of the key elements of creative translation, we use inclusive and diverse texts. Often the texts that are used in our work are things that students might not always come across in the classroom. They might be from languages that might not always be represented formally in a school setting, even if those languages are present in the classroom. We draw a lot on visual prompts, particularly in that decoding stage. And we'll see an example of how that can work in a minute. We have adaptable templates, and really key to our work is resources such as glossaries, dictionaries, and here we have Google Translate. Could have changed that to a few years old, this slide, so I could have changed it to ChatGPT, but I guess for the purposes of what we do with it, Google Translate perhaps is better in terms of the environmental cost. But we use glossaries in our work, which helps access the text. And it really puts that focus on how a translator uses and requires these supports in their work. That a translator isn't a machine where they take a word in one language and it just filters out in another language. It really is a process, and it's based on those supports. Google Translate is often used by our translator facilitators who have the participants create a text, translate the text, and then compare it with what Google would produce in terms of translation. And very often they like their own, well, most of the time, they like their own translation better. in terms of the key skills and competencies, it's very collaborative type of activity. We often have pupils working in groups. It's task-based, and oral performance at the end is something we often integrate into the workshops. Finally, the decoding, often it's like being a language detective. It's about working out, it's about finding an answer to the puzzle. And in that, there's the question of tolerance of error, that it's trying out different solutions. And in addition to being collaborative, in addition to having the possibility to be very cross-curricular and draw in the languages and cultures present in the classroom, creative translation really fosters the key skills that teachers are hoping to develop in their pupils. So reading for meaning, language analysis, evaluation of perspectives, intercultural interest and understanding, particularly of diaspora languages, and the craft of writing, redrafting, and editing. And I think this is really important because this is something that can apply across different subjects, and getting young people to understand that when you write, it's not a one-time thing. You don't sit down and do it once. There is that real process of refining. And I think it really helps young people understand that creativity itself is that process. It's not just this genius with where beautiful poems flow out of. It is really that process. And above all, we focus on showing and not telling. So by getting young people directly involved in what we're doing, showing them how language works by breaking it down, it's very important for our approach. And in terms of the value of this, just to sum up, is that there are kind of three main areas: the critical linguistic awareness, creativity, and language awareness and affirmation. I think not all of those things will be engaged at all times in our workshops. Different parts of the workshop might focus on different areas, but there is the potential to create something that draws these things together. And so creative translation has that potential. So just to show you a small example of this in practice, we ran a project a couple of years ago now with a group of researchers at the University of Oxford, who had a project called Prismatic Jane Eyre. And we worked on the follow-up project. The Prismatic Jane Eyre project sought to track down every translation of Jane Eyre in any language and then understand how words, scenes, and metaphors from the novel morph as they move across languages. And this created a huge database of texts, of information. And we worked with the researchers to create a project that drew on these texts. The project comprised a series of workshops in schools, a nationwide competition, and a bank of resources for pupils and teachers in the 4 project languages, so Arabic, French, Polish, and Spanish. And to give you an idea of what we did in the French workshops, so we started by looking at different book covers of Jane Eyre, either a book cover per group, or this could be done as a class, and ask questions like, how do these different covers present the characters, in particular Jane, and what predictions could be made about the novel based on the cover, and then getting the students to think about what they think is most appropriate, because as you can see, the difference between 3 and 4 is quite stark. We then moved on to translating, and we used back translation, so taking lines translated from French, translated into French, and then having the pupils, with the help of a glossary, translate these back into English, and having them assess what had changed, what was missing, what was added, and what effect those changes had. You can just see on the surface, translation 2 is much longer than translations 1 and 3, and includes a reference to the Emperors of Goldsmith. So you can see that it helps young people understand that things can change in translation, and often it's quite freeing seeing other translations because it helps them feel like have they are empowered in that way to do things that they want to impose themselves on the text. And finally, this workshop finished with the create stage and acts of transcreation. So this took a short paragraph from the novel where Jane and her cousin John fight, and giving two quite directive prompts about how this could be recreated, rewritten. Here it says French or English because it was delivered to a group of a group who were learning French. Uh, yeah, so this shows how you can take a text and get people to take it in different directions. Right. So I'm going to hand over to Ali now, who's going to talk about his experience in the classroom.
Thank you, Stacey. That was really great. And it was a really nice reintroduction for me with the Decode, Translate, Create framework, which I've used in previous years and kind of receded into my memory. So it was also a nice reminder for me. By way of introduction, I'm Ali Al Jamri. I'm a teacher. I teach in Manchester, English teacher, in a high school setting. So from year 7 to year 11. I'm also a multilingual person. I am also a poet and translator in my own rights. So my other language is Arabic, and I had these practices which I bring into my teaching. So I think with regards to translation, it's very much, Stacey mentioned, it's collaborative. I think an even stronger word is community-led. It does build community, and for me, that's part of the way in for me is that it builds community between myself and other learners who might have multiple languages. I noticed in the chat there are people from other countries as well, and if you're teaching English in those other country contexts, you're by definition, you and your students may well have multiple languages. So it's something that is often present. In my case, Manchester is a very multilingual city. There's over 200 languages spoken in Manchester, and that's reflected in our student population. We've got a lot of English kids, yes, but we've also got lots of kids who might speak Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, and various South Asian languages, West African languages. All of the world can sometimes be represented in the classroom. So for me, it's a really interesting way to bring it. And although I have a writing and translation experience, which I'm honest about, and that's why I love Manchester, Nadia. I find it a hometown for me, although I didn't grow up here. But yeah, even though yeah, although that's my basis, you might think, oh, well, I'm not a translator, but I'm an English teacher. How will this relate? I've tried to I'm honest about where I'm coming from, but I also think there's things that anyone can take into their practice. So next slide, please, Stacey. I'm going to have to say that a lot, aren't I? So first of all, I want to start with the idea of promoting an appreciation of language. Before I talk about my case study, there's this idea that translation might be foreign to the English classroom. And actually, we need to remember that English literature stands on the shoulders of translation. So starting with the Bible, if we talk about the early modern era, sometimes we talk about the King James Bible. Well, that was a translation. If we talk about Shakespeare, his education was all in Latin. So he read Virgil, he read loads of Latin poets, Greek texts, Homer, these all inform the English canon. Arabic texts are really important. The Arabian Nights were translated into French and then translated into all European languages starting in the early 1700s. And the Arabian Nights offered this new form of storytelling and this fantastical form of storytelling Gothic literature, Charles Dickens, everything, all of these things have their roots in translation. And without the Arabian Nights, you might not have something. You definitely wouldn't have something like the Ancient Mariner and other romantic poetry like that. And they specifically say that they were, a lot of these romantic poets mention this. Italian, we have the sonnet form. We might all teach sonnets in our classroom context, and we know that that came from an Italian poetic form, Russian, and so forth. And that's just a really an incomplete survey of languages and texts that English literature relies on. So I think the first way in is just, acknowledging that we rely on whatever we're studying, likely in some ways within its context relies on other languages and other traditions, even if we don't fully have full and complete access to them. So we can nurture a culture of celebrating multilingualism as well. I think as English teachers, we can play a role in showing that English is just one of hundreds of languages, and it is not the great colonial imperial language. In my context, a lot of the reason why we of so many different cultures are in Manchester is because of the after effects of colonialism. Well, everyone's language is equally valid, and I think that's something that can come through in the way that we present ourselves as teachers and the culture that we promote in our classrooms. So two small case studies of how that comes out. These are both quite recent. I think we're reading Frankenstein with Year 9 at the moment, and there's a line in Frankenstein, I think it's in at the start of one of the chapter 3, which is, and Victor Frankenstein says, "When I attained the age of 17." And I'd never really thought about this line, but I actually had a student who I'm not sure what languages he might have, but he actually said to me, he's very well read, and he said, "Sir," yes, I said, "isn't that a very non-English way of saying turned 17 when I attained the age of 17?" I was like, yeah, possibly. It was like, because in Arabic, the student loves learning about other languages. Because in Arabic, wouldn't you say something to that effect to say that you're of an age? And I said, yeah, you would say something like, to say I turned 17 would be closer to I attained 17 rather than I turned 17. And it's possibly true in other languages I'm unfamiliar with. And so this was a really small conversation, but it was allowed to happen. It came about because I have always shown an appreciation of other languages, so that the student could kind of go in this exploratory way. So that's a really small way, but it shows that there's an appreciation for that which comes from outside of English into English literature in my classroom, and it allows for these conversations to happen. In another teaching Romeo and Juliet, I was very keen to um, talk about how symbols might translate across cultures. In Romeo and Juliet, the moon is an evil thing, and at one point Romeo swears his love on Juliet upon the moon, and Juliet tells him, "Swear not upon the moon. It is an inconstant thing that changes with the seasons," or something to that effect. And I stopped and I paused, and I've got a lot of kids of a Muslim and Arab backgrounds in that classroom. And I said, well, in Shakespeare, he sees the moon as a really bad thing, but do you see the moon as a bad thing? And Arabic poetry is full of glorification of the moon. It's considered the most beautiful object that you could compare a person to. And obviously the moon plays a big symbolic role as an image with Ramadan. It's become one of those famous Islamic images. And so even in terms of just thinking about, well, is this universal? Is Shakespeare universal? I think in some ways we can argue yes, but is the way that he's talking about the moon universal? No, and we have many different cultures in this room where we might never respond to the moon in the way that Juliet responds to the moon in this text. And again, that creates an appreciation that how we might be raised, and I was one of these third culture kids where we spoke one language at home and then I spoke a different language at school. And it's a way of saying what's happening in your own home, that's not a different world away. You don't need to separate that from who you are at school. In fact, your learning at school can be informed by what might be going on at home. So, next slide, please, Stacey. So considerations, I think, is, considering what I've said, we might think about how many of us teach schemes that include the Greek myths or myths more broadly. None of these were originally written in English, but we present texts in English. Okay, we can't study Icarus or Prometheus or Oedipus without reading it in English because that's the language that we've got. But perhaps there's a way of problematizing that fact, or and inspecting it in an interesting way with our students. So I put an example question here, just a prompt, like, what if you gave a myth from two different sources? They're all translations and retellings anyway, and actually open up the fact that there is not one version of the myth of Prometheus or Icarus or so on. There are only retellings. And today we're going to look at a retelling, and perhaps tomorrow we'll look at a different retelling, and then we can look at, well, how does Graves tell this story? How does Fry tell this story? And so again, I'm aware that sometimes our own limitation on language can limit what we can bring into translation. However, so much of what we consider the English canon is born of translation that we can bring these questions into the classroom in this way. My next case study, next slide, please. So is Sujata Butt's Search for My Tongue. This is a poem. If you're in England, and a teacher in England, you're probably very aware of this poem. It used to be a GCSE text. It's still very popularly taught in Key Stage 3. And I haven't included the whole poem, but the third stanza of the poem is in Gujarati, and it's there in front of us. Now, the typical standard one is it is not translated in the middle. So how do we approach the untranslated middle of this text? And there's so many different ways to do that. You've obviously got the first, essentially the first stanza talks about how her mother tongue has rotted away and died, and she speaks this foreign tongue now. And then it mentions that when she dreams, it says, but overnight while I dream, and then it goes into this middle stanza in Gujarati. And then following, it goes into the third stanza where it says, it grows back. And it ends on the lines, my mother tongue, every time I think I've lost my mother tongue, it blossoms out of my mouth. Okay, and it's very easy to find this poem online if you want to just search for it. I just wanted to think about that middle section, particularly how do we approach it? So next slide, please. So this is a great poem because it's part of the English literature canon within the context of schools in England. And it allows us to approach it in many different ways. So for example, if you've got a Gujarati speaker, whether that's teachers or students, you might use them as a resource. In my case, one of my colleagues is a native Gujarati speaker, so he's recorded the whole poem and he reads the poem in Gujarati. Of course, it's there transliterated so you can try, but he does it in, with that kind of native fluency, which is then really wonderful to hold. But one thing I've never actually asked him, what does it mean? And in a way, I don't want to know because I find it helpful in the way that I teach it not to know, because it helps us sit with that discomfort of not knowing. I think in translation, we need to accept that something may be gained, but something will always be lost. And how do we appreciate that which we cannot fully understand? I think that's a really high level concept that unlocks, high grades and an appreciation of English, not just as a subject, but as, reading and literacy as a lifelong practice in a young person. Another exploratory activity there is imagine you are the poet. Write what she might have said, although write it in English. So you might say, well, and then you might ask them, well, what would your dream be about? What are some things in your culture? And even if we are monoculture, say you're in a room, you're an English teacher who only speaks English, and you've got students who only speak English, this is where we might draw on dialect. And we know a lot of dialects have fallen out. And we know that a lot of us, particularly older family members, often have a rich, appreciation of their own dialects. And Nana talks in a certain way that no one else in the family talks, and she might use words that no one else uses because she grew up in this part of Scotland before, and whatever else. So you might still find that there are these ways of, well, what's that idea of that private family language that we have to leave behind and still translate, because we still, present different parts of ourselves and different part of how we speak, even if we are within one language. So there are ways to approach this, even if we don't have maybe other languages to draw on within our school community. Next slide, please. So these slides, this next one, there's really, I should have added a slide in before kind of introducing this. I run a creative writing club in my school, and I've done this for several years now, and we tend to focus on poetry because of my bias towards that and trying to raise my students' appreciation. And I've got a lot of students who have a different language. So we wanted to try the decode, translate, and create functions, and you'll actually see decode there in the top right. And I've got a Mandarin speaking student who's very passionate about China. She, and I said to her, why don't you share a poem? And she got really excited and she found 3 poems from me. She said, I didn't know where to look at first. And I said, go ask your parents. I'm sure they'll be able to tell you. She went and she found 3 poems with her mum that she then brought back. And she was like, I don't know what to do, which one to pick. So I sat there, worked with her. And together with her, we made a PowerPoint presentation, and she led a session of the work of the club. So this is actually the second of her slides. The first one was an introduction to to where she's from in China, and she's written it in the Mandarin script, and she's and she has photos of the beautiful nature there, and then we come to decode, and we started with pictures that she's picked out that relate to the poem she wanted to share. With that prompt and some very juxtaposing images, particularly between those 2 birds. And even for me, it really that first image of the dead bird really raised my, got an emotional response out of me. And I thought, why have you chosen this? And actually, it was a really interesting thing, which we see in the next slide. The poem that she'd chosen was by I King. I might have said it wrong, and I apologize if I have. And I can't remember the title of the poem. It seems she didn't include it now, I see. She first included it in Mandarin, and then she put it in Pinyin, so this transliterated Mandarin, and then her translation. And I guided her on how to do this translation and spoke to her about keeping it as literal as possible, and also in some places giving us multiple potential words. And there is a slide I didn't include, but where she's included just the English, but she's for each of these words, she went and she gave synonyms for words which don't translate perfectly into from Mandarin to English. I said, what's a word? I think it might have been something, for instance, like rotted. Is the word actually rotted in Mandarin, or does it have multiple meanings, for instance, or the word angry? So she gave this, and then we discussed it as a class. She read it out first in Mandarin, then we discussed it as a club. And then I asked them, I want you to, using the English as a guide, I want you to rewrite it in your own words. Okay, and in your own words, and I want you to really think about every single word, put it in your own terms. How can you tell this? And then the next slide. So then the final part was the create. So having worked with the poem, and we've only got 1 hour here, and we don't have, and I had adapted the decode, translate, create to kind of suit the needs of my students. And I might mention there, in the one who led this is in year 8, so she's about 13 or so. But there were students from the ages of 11 to 14, I think, participating. So the last one was choose one, write a short story or a poem about your home from a bird's perspective. And in the end, this particular poem that she had chosen, it was a poem that a Chinese poet wrote during World War II on the advent of the Japanese invasion of mainland China. So I considered, shall we go into the context? I thought actually this is I can imagine why this is the poem that she might find, but there's quite a lot of potentially traumatic histories there. So it kind of steered a little bit away from the context. I thought we don't need to make this about that, but it also opens the door for that if she wants to pursue it later. We decided to focus on this idea of the bird, but also the juxtaposition between life and death, love and nature. And I got some great responses. So I haven't included the poems. However, I got, I did make some scans of some poems, but I thought maybe as this is being recorded, I wouldn't want it in this student work in kind of in perpetuity. Have I said that right online? But for instance, many of the students wrote poems identifying themselves with a bird, exploring this idea of death through the eyes of this fallen bird. The poem she chose, I mean, teenagers love this idea of like the grotesque and the gothic ideas of, and life and death. So it was a really interesting way for all of the students to engage with. And ultimately, also, the student got a chance to show off her love for her culture, her deep appreciation, her ability to go between these languages and share something deeply resonant within her with her community, with her colleagues as well, as other fellow students. So, um, so for me, I think that coming back to community, that's the great thing that it did. And I can't be there in 10, 15 years to know how this might affect her. She might forget about it once she leaves school and so on. But I think that these things, these ways of saying that your culture matters, even if you're monolingual and you don't recognize sometimes, because sometimes the monolingual kids will go, I've only got English. Well, yeah, but you've still got something. You've still that's valuable. And to tell people that what they bring from their home, whatever home might be, is valuable. I think that's the most powerful thing that translation I find can do as a teacher. So my final slide is some considerations about case study. This works really well. What I've shown has worked really well in a club environment, but how would it work in a lesson structure? And I find that the formality of lesson structures have made it more difficult for me to actually bring that kind of thing in, because you need everyone to be respectful, you need everyone to buy in, you need that safe environment, and it isn't always possible to have that in the lesson where you have strict rules that need to be followed. You've got kids who don't like the subject or who might sometimes bring in their own rivalries with each other rather than, and may not always be respectful. I think it's making sure that we have that unquestionable respect for each other is a really important part. And I found that clubs just make it a lot easier to manage that aspect. Collaboration is a fundamental aspect of literary engagement. So it was collaborative. This student worked with me to create the slides. She worked with her mum to find the poems. And the students collaborated with each other and shared out loud what they wrote together. How can it be adapted for a lesson? I think there are ways that this can be brought in, and particularly going back to my idea of like, comparing to translations of Greek myths, for instance, you could then use that as the jumping off point of retelling this myth in your own words. You may also work with the MFL department with your Spanish teachers or French teachers or whatever language it might be that's also taught alongside English, because that's another subject that students learn. So all students, at least in England, have some level of multilingualism because they've got Spanish or French lessons, or it's usually Spanish or French. Um, Maybe perhaps working with those teachers to find a poem or a text that is accessible for students to do in English and to translate something. And there will be texts such as, I don't know, for instance, Borges, who's, I've probably mispronounced his name and I apologize, the Latin American writer. Much of what he writes is very short fiction. So translations of that from Spanish into English, for instance. There are many ways of doing that, but it does require just kind of sitting down and experimenting and having, I think the most important thing, having that enjoyment of experimenting, and also that lack of fear about things going wrong, that trust that it's okay not to be in full control of the translation, because that is part of the literary. I think that's part of what makes someone an expert in English and in languages is being able to find comfort in some of these unknown portions. I think we can do that as teachers, where sometimes our tendency is we don't want to anything to catch us off guard. I think being prepared to be caught off guard and roll with it helps do this in and to do it effectively. So I think that's me done, Stacey. I hopefully I kept to time there as well.
Yeah, no, wonderful there. And I could sort of segue nicely into the resources that are available and the opportunities there are. So as Ali was saying, it's actually one of the difficulties with this is where do you start? Where do you find a poem, especially if you're not someone who has an interest, or not necessarily an interest, but easy access to poems, texts, and other languages. On the Stephen Spender Trust website, we have virtual poetry booklets in 17 languages. We have a database as well of poetry in lots of different poems in different languages, as well as activities in all these languages, which range from the usual languages you'll see in schools, so French, Spanish, German, depending on certain schools as well, but also Romanian, Polish, Arabic, Urdu. So there's lots of resources on our website, and a lot of these do come with the glossaries as well. And if you want to take things further, if you've been very, very inspired, which hopefully you have, the Stephen Spender Prize is an annual competition. Ali has previously entered students and a student who won, I think, definitely one of the categories.
Commended, I think she
Sorry?
was commended.
Candid. It's just as good as winning. And so the main competition is for young people, and they can translate a poem in any language into English. Any language. It might be if you saw the first image of the tree, it did include Anglo-Saxon, so we have received entries from Anglo-Saxon into English previously in the past. And we also have a special competition for Portuguese this year, where the students choose a poem from a booklet. The competition is open for entries until the 31st of July, and it is free to enter. And the other thing to say, there is also a category for teachers, if you would like to give it a go yourself. We have some resources, which I'm going to put in the chat. They include links to our general resources page, our Prismatic Jane Eyre resource page, the Stephen Spender Prize page, and a really excellent blog post that Ali wrote a couple of years ago about his work in schools. So I'll pop them in the chat now. And I don't know if we've got time for questions. There are a few in the chat. Oh, one in the chat about collaboration between MFL and English literature and language.
Yeah, go on, squeeze that one in quick.
If I go quickly, we haven't formally collaborated. We did do a workshop with sixth formers, which included students who were studying French and students who were studying English. I think, as you recognize, Sheila, that actually it's often difficult with schools when they do work in isolation, but is definitely has a lot of potential. But I guess it's just putting it in practice.
I'm happy to come in on a few of those questions as well. I think to answer Sheila's, I think, yeah, that's difficult if there are. I think that depends on the specific school culture and school dynamics. And the children can be a great asset to that, because I know in the GCSE context, for instance, or a high school context, I can say to them, go and ask your Spanish teacher or so on. And I can then use almost the student as a conduit if I don't have that relationship to the teacher. Or I can just use this as an excuse to go and build up that relation. But it does require active relationship building, especially if it's not there. And I think it's just a barrier that people have to actively work to overcome. And then I know Liz also asked a question about this asking like, where are you from? I find like children have no filter and they often ask that. Like my Arabic accent sometimes comes out. For instance, if I'm addressing someone called Muhammad, I will say Muhammad occasionally, and it will come out that very Arabic way of actually pronouncing that name. So then they'll be like, so, what's going on? And I think, again, there's a way of asking that in a pejorative way, which can be kind of like, this kind of inquisition that can be a bit uncomfortable. And then there are ways of asking that where it's almost like, what are you, where are you, almost a way where you're just out of genuine, love to share in the multiculturalism of the company that you're in. And I think a way of maybe asking it is, what languages do you speak as well? What languages do you speak and why? Why do you speak that? And it might be, I speak this language and that language because my dad is from here and my mum is from there. Or I also speak a little bit of this because I grew up there. And so there's a way of perhaps broadening that and, learning about each other without that really direct and question of where are you from that can come across as insulting at times. Yeah.
And I think just to add a nice activity that we sort of have in our activities booklet for our facilitators, the original activity is called Multilingual Monsters because the text that followed was based on a monster. But the idea was getting groups of young people to draw a monster, which doesn't have to be a great looking monster, but to then label that monster with words in any language. So you might have 10 different words in different languages for the word arm. And that is a really nice way of kind of drawing that out in a kind of in a way that isn't singling anyone out or asking people directly, depending on I guess, the dynamics of the group and how well you know the students. And it really shows that it feels like they're all contributing to one thing. They're all bringing a different aspect and something that's unique to them because the person sitting next to them might know a different answer or might know a different word for the word arm.
Thank you so much, Stacey and Ali. The creative translation schema is just, I think, is so empowering. That's what I really love about it. I think it just, gives the young people in the classroom such agency. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this afternoon. And I hope to see you at another of our events soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.